In the previous session, we took a look at Jeremiah's commissioning. We looked at these 6 verbs in 1 verse 10 that give structure to the remainder of the book of Jeremiah and help us understand the core kerygma or message of the prophet. In this session, we're going to move into the text and we're going to look at chapters 1 and 52, the opening and the closing of the whole book. Now, Jeremiah, just like any other prophet, there's always this twofold movement of judgment and restoration. As you read most prophets in the Old Testament, they're going to combine these two together, judgment and restoration. But Jeremiah brilliantly displays this in an incredible way. And so we should really anticipate ourselves to, at the end of this topic, to stand in awe of that twofold movement of God for judgment and restoration. So let's get into it. We already looked at the first initial 10 verses in our previous session of Jeremiah, and that's his commissioning. And then at some point, we don't know when, but God gives him from 11 to verse 19, he gives him 2 signs. Okay? Now, this is a common thing in prophetic literature where the prophet will have a vision and will see some sign that is rather confusing, especially if it's not interpreted for you. Now, in lots of cases, the sign is interpreted. Jeremiah or any prophet will see something, and then God will say what it means. And then we're meant to interpret what that sign means based off of our interpretation of what's the meaning that's written down. And so he sees 2 things. One, he sees an almond branch, and then another, he sees a boiling pot. Okay? And so the first one, we'll take them one by one. The first one is an almond branch. God asks Jeremiah what he sees. Jeremiah says what he sees, and God says, yes, very good, you've seen well, and then tells him what it is. Okay? And he says, I am watching over my word to perform it. Okay? So God's interpreted the vision for us, but we still don't know how they relate. Jeremiah, it would have made sense in his mind, right? Because he doesn't ask another question. But for us, we're wondering, well, how does him seeing an almond, how does God showing Jeremiah an almond branch communicate that God is watching over his word? Okay? If you look a little deeper, it's due to the Hebrew words that are used. The word for almond is shaked, and the word for watching is shakad. So right in that, he looks at an almond branch, that even that branch, the word for almond, shaked, sounds familiar and will remind him of shakad, to watch over. And so the almond branch becomes a symbol that the Lord uses to tell Jeremiah, I'm watching over my word to perform it. And we notice the word, right? The word was to destroy but rebuild, to pluck up but to plant. That's a seemingly contradictory word, yet the Lord promises to watch over it until it happens. And we see this repeated in 31 verse 28. Where God says, I've watched over my word to destroy, and now I'm going to watch over to rebuild. Because chapter 31 is right in the midst of the hopeful passages of Jeremiah. But there's a second meaning to this. When you think about an almond branch. Now, the almond branch or the almond tree, it is the first to bud in the region where Jeremiah would have lived, and it would bud during the harsh winter storms of January and February, when no other plant is budding. Now, what that can also communicate is that this plant grows when it seems impossible, right? And so God is also communicating to Jeremiah that his word will happen when it seems impossible, like a plant bursting into bloom in the midst of a winter storm. And there will be many moments in Jeremiah's career where it's like a storm. And he's wondering, God, how will you come through in this moment? How will your promises and your words actually come about? And we'll see many moments that I think Jeremiah would have sat back and thought about the almond branch. Maybe on his way to Jerusalem, he passes some almond trees and knows that it seems chaotic and it seems crazy, but the word of the Lord will come about. He's watching over it to happen. We can easily apply this to our lives. Maybe you have some words in your life that seem illogical, seem contradictory, or just plain seem impossible. But you can know that God is watching over those words to perform them in your life. And at the moment where it seems unlikely, the fulfillment can come. And so it's a call for us to trust in the Lord. Now, the second symbol that Jeremiah looks at, if the first one relates to kind of God's faithfulness to act, the second one talks about what he will do, what action he will take. And so Jeremiah looks, and it's the exact same phrasing, kind of mirrored after the first one. He looks in verse 13, while the Lord says, "What do you see?" Exactly like he said in verse 11. And Jeremiah says, "I see a boiling pot facing away from the north." Okay? God doesn't compliment him on what he's seen, but he just tells him what it means, okay? And what it means is in verse 14. "Then the Lord said to me, out of the north disaster shall be let loose on the land." Now, we don't know if Jeremiah saw these two visions right after each other. Like he sees the almond branch, God interprets it, and then he turns around and has a vision of a boiling pot from the north. This could have been days apart, even months apart. And so what pulls these together is the first sign says that I'll be faithful to act. The second sign then says what I'm going to do, what action I'm going to take. And right now it just says that he will bring about disaster from the north. And so this is probably near the beginning of Jeremiah's career. We know that he started in the 13th year of Josiah, and at that point, Babylon wasn't really a threat, right? As we looked at a few sessions ago, Assyria was the main threat and was kind of declining, and Babylon was the up and rising world power, but no one would expect that just yet. And so it makes sense if God says that disaster will come from the north, okay? So that indicates that it was probably early on. And then it says that the king will come from the north. This is now in verse 15, okay? You can observe a place there, right? The kings will come, and they will set his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, right in the middle there of verse 15. Now, the gate is where you would make decisions, right? That you see that all throughout the scripture, important decisions seem to happen in the gate, right? That people sit in the gate. Kings sit and meet at the gate. In the ancient Near Eastern perspective, what this would mean to them, all right, the original readers back then and there, is that a conquering king would sit in the gate and pronounce judgment on the city. And so, but what's really happening is the king sits at the gate, and then notice verse 16, "And I will declare judgments against them." Not the king sitting in the gate, right? So there will be a king from the north that sits in the gate, and you'd expect him to announce judgment. But God's saying it's not actually that king sitting in the gate, right? I'm announcing judgment through that king in the gate. Again, a prophet doesn't tell us so much the future, right? Even though this is a future coming prophecy, but it's in the next 20 or so years, or 40 years, sorry. But through Jeremiah, God's pulling back the curtain so people understand what's happening. And so in verse 16, we can see why these judgments are coming. Okay, you can observe the connector there. 4, and then there's the list. That's a great observation. And there's 3 things. 1, for their evil in forsaking me, kind of a broad, general one. And then it defines the evil in the next phrase. They've made offerings to other gods and worshipped the work of their own hands. They've broke commandments 1 and 2 from the 10 commandments. And the rest of the book will kind of give us more detail of this. Okay? And so Jeremiah's commissioning, right? It talks about God will judge, but he'll also bring about restoration. And then the symbols that he sees, they talk about the judgment that God is watching over to bring on his people. And so right in chapter 1, we see a dual theme already of judgment and restoration, as indicated by 1 verse 10. Right? So now as we turn to the mirror passage of this, all the way to the end, chapter 52, we should expect to also see judgment and restoration, which is exactly what we find. Okay? So before chapter 52, we have all of these other chapters about the judgment against the nations, all the way from 45 up until chapter including 51. And so that's what separates 52 totally apart, because it's not about the foreign nations anymore. all of a sudden the book switches to speaking about actually the fall of Jerusalem and no longer speaking about the nations. Now, the two key themes we need to identify here is judgment and restoration. And so we can easily see judgment from verse 1 all the way up until verse 30. And there's kind of four main parts. Okay? First off, we see in verse 4 that the king from the north that enters the city is King Nebuchadnezzar from Babylon. Right? This is the fulfillment of the word to bring destruction, to destroy and overthrow. That happens from the north through the king of Babylon called Nebuchadnezzar. We see at the beginning, right, how he destroys the city and Zedekiah flees. And the end result of Zedekiah, the final king of Judah, is that his sons are killed and he's taken captive into Babylon. That takes us all the way to verse 11 of this chapter. Then the next major section is from 12 to 16. And it talks about how the king burns the temple. Now, again, this is a worldview shifting moment, right? We'll look at that later. But the temple is the place where God dwells. And if the temple is destroyed, what massive implications does that say about God? About the God of the Israelite people if a pagan king was able to burn his home, his very place of dwelling in their midst. Then after that, it progresses to speak about how the people were taken into exile. This is from verse 17 to 23, and then continuing on from 24 to 30. One is about the items of the temple taken into exile. That's 17 to 23. And then the next one, 24 to 30, is the people taken into exile. And it's all summarized. The judgment of the people is summarized in the end of verse 27. So Judah was taken into exile out of its land. Now, we can go back to chapter 1 and kind of tick the box for judgment. God said he would watch over his word to bring judgment, and he has done that faithfully through the king Nebuchadnezzar. He's taken his people into exile. Now, in the coming sessions, we'll answer why that had to be the case and what brought that about. But before we do that, if you're not so familiar with this term, you might be wondering what exile actually is. Okay, so Exodus is the moment where God frees them from being slaves, right? He transitions them from being slaves to being sons. They were, in a sense, captive in Egypt, and then the Lord rescues them, and that's called the Exodus, okay, as we've went over and over and over again. Now, the exile is the reversal of that. God takes his people that are free, his sons that are free, and they're taken into captivity. This is a good word to observe from verse 28 to 30. It's repeated 3 times. They're taken captive. And so as they were originally captive in Egypt, now they've gone full circle and have become captive again in the nation of Babylon. And so what began as a victorious story out of Egypt with the Exodus now seems to have reached a rather hopeless conclusion, right? They're no longer living in the land. And perhaps in some of their minds, we're no longer the people of God, for God does not dwell with us. His temple's been burned, and we now live in exile. So again, what kind of encouragement can God offer his people at this moment? How can the words of Jeremiah be compiled together to bring about a message of exhortation to keep following? And we'll see that. Then the narrative jumps 21 years ahead. In classic Jeremiah fashion, he shows no respect for dates or times, but it's more messages that he wants to put together. So if God's judgment did come, and that was in 586 BC, and that's detailed from 52 verses 1 all the way to 30, now 21 years ahead, Jeremiah, and this is the latest event in the book of Jeremiah, he speaks about the restoration of one king. This is the king Jehoiachin, okay? He's also called in Jeremiah Coniah, and he was a king who was in charge just before Zedekiah. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at him because his life is rather shocking, right? We read the narrative that in 21 years after the exile has happened, in the 37th year of the exile, that means the year he was taken into exile, not the year Zedekiah was taken into exile, he's freed. And he's not just freed, but he's taken out of prison and he sits at the table with the king. Right? He's given a seat above the other kings that have been taken captive. Now, why does Jeremiah end with this story? And because of the context, we're meant to compare King Jehoiachin to King Zedekiah. Now, notice how Zedekiah's life ended in 52 verse 11. He put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him in chains, and the king of Babylon took him to Babylon and put him in prison till the day of his death. Now, that time, till the day of his death, is repeated in Jeremiah. When he's speaking about King Jehoiachin at the end of verse 34. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given him by the king according to his daily needs until the day of his death, as long as he lived. So one king was in captive until the day of his death, and the other king was actually liberated and provided for until the day of his death. And so because of that similar phrasing, we're meant to compare the one to another. One lives in prison until he dies, and one is exalted and lives in an exalted state until the day of his death. And as we get into the text, we'll see the reason why. The one who rebelled is the one who is in prison, the one who is in captive forever. And the one who is humble is actually the one who is exalted. And so we'll spend more time in this, but as we look at these two kings, Jehoiachin shows us the path we are to take if we want to dine with the king. The King Jesus, of course. How do we get to the table with Jesus? What steps do we take? What heart posture, what action needs to be done? Or, on the other hand, as Zedekiah, what do we do as we rebel that leaves us in bondage away from the presence of God? And so we'll put ourselves in the story as we compare the two paths of King Jehoiachin and King Zedekiah. Now, we can go back to chapter 1 and tick the second box, the one promising restoration, right? God said, you will pluck up and plant. We've looked and destroy and rebuild. We've seen in chapter 51, a large chunk of it relates to the destruction. And now we've looked at the restoration through the two narratives, competing narratives of King Zedekiah and King Jehoiachin. And Jehoiachin then becomes a foretaste or a first fruit for the exiles that what happened to Jehoiachin will one day also happen to them. Just as he was freed from his exile, so too will they. That's of course why Jeremiah ends with this story and not the story of Zedekiah. This would have brought great hope for the people living in exiles. That's the interpretation we can make as they read this story. And the application for us, as I've already suggested, is what do we need to do to live like Jehoiachin, and what do we not need to do so that we don't live like Zedekiah? And we'll spend a lot more time on that, but it has to do with surrender or rebellion. So, chapter 1 opens the book of Jeremiah with both of these themes, judgment and restoration, and then Jeremiah closes his book with these themes as well, judgment and restoration. Now, in classic Jeremiah fashion, the judgment gets a lot more airtime, right? There's about 30 verses in this chapter that talk about judgment, and then just a brief 5 verses that talk about restoration. So that's roughly 87% of chapter 52 is judgment, and 13% of chapter 52 is restoration. Now, when you don't include those and look at the overall picture of Jeremiah, it's roughly the same. 89% of the chapters of Jeremiah talk about judgment, whereas just 11% of the chapters in Jeremiah deal with restoration. Now, again, if you kind of go the route of not looking at Jeremiah in its totality and just taking chapter by chapter, you're going to end again with a picture that Jeremiah is mainly about judgment. And it is, but that's not the main message. That's why literary structure is so important. Now, to the average reader, Jeremiah is a message of judgment and destruction, and there's a few little glimpses of hope, right? Jeremiah 29:11, that might be the most famous passage in Jeremiah. Okay, you've seen it in bookstores, you've seen it, colorfully displayed in people's homes. It's a great hopeful passage, right? And chapter 1 verse 5, right? I knew you before you were formed in the womb, and I consecrated you and appointed you. This verse is to baby dedications what 1 Corinthians 13 is to wedding ceremonies, right? It's used again and again and again, and those are kind of the two verses we really walk away with from Jeremiah. And so it's a book of judgment with little bits of hope. And sadly, this kind of affirms our view of the God of the Old Testament that we have, or perhaps even more dangerously, the God of the whole Bible. That he is a God that's angry, just waiting for us to step out of line and chuck a lightning bolt at us. But that's not at all the characteristic of God. Yes, there's mercy and justice, but sometimes we tend to side more with the justice side of God. But we see in Jeremiah how these two are beautifully blended together. And we get introduced to that theme with chapter 1 and chapter 52. There's judgment, but there's also restoration. Now, in the coming sessions, we're going to look a little more in depth to see why this judgment had to come about.